Everyone, welcome to today's Bronftalk. There's so much happening right now between the election and COVID, and right now in the Senate, a new justice being confirmed. And to make sense of it all, there's no two people I'd rather be talking to than Mattie and Isaac. So I'm very much looking forward to this. I have lots of questions for them, but definitely would love as many questions as possible from everyone watching. So at any point, feel free to message me with a question, and we'll bring you into the conversation as quickly as we can. So I'll just introduce our two speakers today. Mattie Kahn is Culture Director at Glamour. So good to see you, Mattie.
Good to see you, Jim.
And Isaac Dovere is a staff writer at The Atlantic and host of the fantastic podcast, The Ticket. Isaac, thanks so much for doing this.
I'm really happy to.
Cool. So to jump in, as I said, right now in the Senate, there's a vote that's about to be taking place. And there's so much that's unprecedented about this. I know, Isaac, you were talking to Cory Booker about sort of the Democratic strategy around it. Is there more they could have done, and sort of how is he making sense of what's happening?
I mean, there is not more that they could have done to stop it. There's probably more that they could have done to make a big deal out of it. I think one of the strange things, and I've talked to a bunch of people about this, but I talked to Booker about it too, is that they complained about the process while participating in the process, right? It was speeches at a committee hearing saying this is awful, which is not exactly in touch with the desire among many Democrats, and I think it's past the sort of base at this point, but to make a big deal out of this. Some of that is because most of the people in the United States Senate, whatever party they're in, are not really comfortable doing that kind of stuff. And some of it is because the Democrats are worried about a kind of backlash for which they think is in part what happened 2 years ago with Brett Kavanaugh. And some of it is because Biden clearly didn't want it. And he is, when I say want it, he didn't want it to be a big explosive thing. And he's the leader of the party at this point. And a lot of conversations happen behind the scenes between the principals and their aides. And you couldn't create a situation where Democrats in the Senate were doing something to create more of a stunt to protest this, and then Biden being in a position of being pressed to say, do you agree with this? And basically saying no, that would not have been a good look either. And so that's part of what this is. And again, like none of it matters because whatever the Democrats would have done wouldn't have mattered in the direct way of Amy Coney Barrett being a justice or not. It might have mattered in changing the way the political balance on this was.
Yeah, and there's so much more to talk about in terms of how this new balance in the court is going to shape things going forward. So I hope we'll get into that as we go a little bit more. But Mattie, as Isaac was saying, obviously this was there is more that could have been done to sort of change the perception of the judge. And so I sort of like, what's your take on how she's been perceived and sort of this whole sort of play that the Republicans have been making to emphasize her being a mother? And I mean, you ran this sort of fabulous piece in Glamour about that. So I wonder if you could talk about sort of that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's nothing Republicans love better than a woman who has succeeded despite every obstacle that they themselves have put in place to make her life more difficult. And Amy Coney Barrett, with her sizable family, as much has been made of that, I think stood very much for that this was an extremely accomplished woman, which she undoubtedly is with this very big family. I think a lot of emphasis in terms of like that motherhood quality was to play to the ideals of Republican womanhood. But I also think in some ways it felt a little pointed compared to the other women who are on the court right now, who certainly don't have families like that. She, I think, stood in for, what they think an accomplished woman should look like. This is a woman with an incredibly impressive career who also has had this big family, who lives her values in this way that they very much wanted to make untouchable in terms of her Catholic faith and the life choices that she's made. We did run a piece about the racial components of that family, of her as a model of white motherhood in particular, that I think resonated strongly with people. It ended up getting a lot of play because the Catholic League was very upset with us for doing that. But I think the connotations of that piece, which was written by the writer Liz Lenz, who's wonderful and writes for Glamour a lot, was that much has been made of the kind of woman that Amy Coney Barrett is, and women like her have often stood as gatekeepers, preventing other women, often Black women or brown women, from succeeding. When they have the kind of families that Amy Coney Barrett has, they are not held up as paragons of the feminine ideal. They are often derided for various reasons that have to do with class and race as much as anything else. So yes, I think they emphasized her motherhood on purpose. And I think honestly, even the Democrats did that. I mean, you saw that with Senator Feinstein or other Democrats praising her for being such an incredible working mother. I'm sure everyone on the Zoom call knows that there is no such concept as a working father. So those kinds of things definitely come into play with her for sure.
It felt like a sort of like easy bipartisan concession to make in some ways, but obviously much more loaded than that.
Lovely family. It is pretty inoffensive.
But what do you make of the sort of fact that, like, even the sort of initials, the sort of playing up of ACB and sort of her being specifically chosen to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg? How do you see her role stepping into this sort of being cast as a sort of pseudo-feminist in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, Amy Coney Barrett's career is only possible because of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She is the reason that, in large part, that women like Amy Coney Barrett can succeed and have the kinds of careers that they have. I mean, this is Liz's phrasing from the Glamour piece, not mine, but I did see it not just in Liz's piece, but everywhere, that women like Ruth Bader Ginsburg open doors so that women like Amy Coney Barrett can walk through them and shut the door behind them. There is no question that her life is made possible by women like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I think the right, especially in 2018, really suffered from a lack of strong conservative women candidates in terms of the midterms. I think they're often looking to women in the party to be sort of stealthy, better messengers for their policies, because it is harder to criticize a woman who is parroting the kinds of things that they stand for. It's harder to tag a woman as sexist or misogynistic or any of the other labels that tend to get ascribed to their men. And I think they very much relish the opportunity to turn Amy Coney Barrett into a figurehead. They are lacking in those in terms of women on the Republican side, and she is a good model for them.
Yeah, certainly more effectively done than the previous nomination, than their effort with Justice.
Better branding for sure.
Yeah. Question. What's that?
Better merch opportunities.
Right, definitely. Yeah. We'll look forward to that line of sweatshirts. So, Isaac, to jump back into sort of the election and what we're seeing in terms of voting, what do you make of sort of these early turnout results, and how much do you think we can read into that?
We can read some stuff into it, but not necessarily anything too definitive. The big question, the word that the political class uses for this is cannibalizing the vote. So the question is whether, if we're at about 50 million people, must be more than that as of today, but let's say 50 million who voted early at this point, how many of those 50 million would have voted on election day otherwise? Are those new voters? We don't know. It does certainly seem to be the case that some of them are new voters. The stats that jump out are that I think there are now 3 counties in Texas that are already have broken records for county turnout just in the early vote. And they are in parts of Texas that are not expected to be Trump country. There was another one that really got me over the weekend, that more Black men over 65 have voted in Georgia already than voted in total in 2016. Those are not Trump voters. And so that does suggest that the vote is going to be higher by a chunk overall, and that the early voting is going to be a factor, whether it's early voting in person or by mail or all those things. What, of course, this comes down to is where the vote actually is. And, it is almost impossible, given what we're seeing, that Joe Biden would lose the popular vote. But as Hillary Clinton likes to point out, that doesn't really get you very far necessarily. So will there be enough states where a small margin could put the electoral votes to Trump? There could. The pathways for that are getting harder and harder to see. The best example probably from 2016 is Michigan, that Trump won by 10,704 votes. I don't think that there's anybody who is seriously looking at what's going on there who believes that Trump is going to win Michigan again. Trump could lose Michigan, and if he holds everything else, then he will still get to 270 something electoral votes, but enough to be the president. But there are other things that are going on that really do point in a very Biden direction. Arizona looks like it is probably going to go for Biden. And once that happens, then you get to a place where it is very, very hard for Trump to win. The reason why you may, if you guys don't know it, but the reason why a lot of people are paying attention to Florida as a place to flip to Biden potentially is because Florida counts the early votes before Election Day, which means that we will know probably, maybe not all, though it depends if the margin's slim, but we will probably have a sense of whether Trump won Florida or Biden won Florida on election night. And if Biden wins Florida, there is no way that Trump could be elected president. It's not mathematically possible. If Biden, if Trump wins Florida, Biden could still win, but Trump can't win without Florida. But of course, it could be that there's late counting in 2012. It took a couple of days to figure out for sure that Obama had won Florida and not Romney. So it's not a sure thing, but that's why Obama has been focusing on campaigning there in this last week, and you're going to see more efforts there, and why Mike Bloomberg has put $100 million into it and all this stuff. But the early voting matters, and it matters anyway, even if not for the pandemic, but it matters even more for the pandemic. And one thing I was saying this to Adam earlier, there are some people who are starting to think that with the irony of the poll observing or watching or whatever Trump and his allies are calling it at this point, is that when they show up on election day, it is possible that they will, in a lot of places, be hitting a higher concentration of Trump voters than.
So back up for what you're
right.
talking about. Trump during the first debate was asking his supporters to act as poll watchers. So just about what typically are poll watchers there to do, and what theoretically?
Well, I mean, there are poll watchers who they're the people who work for who are volunteering or hourly work for the polls running things. But then there are the people. Excuse me. In most places, you can go in to a polling place. You just walk in as long as you're not doing anything. But I can walk in as a reporter or whatever. But and you can go in as long as you're not doing. The word is electioneering, like if you don't have like a t-shirt on or handing out pamphlets. So as long as it's not specifically with a campaign, it is usually legal to be in the space, and they could be saying like, we just want to make sure the votes are secure, right? And if you imagine the situation where in a swing area, most of the Biden voters have voted before Election Day, then who's going to be left voting on Election Day because they haven't been pushed by the Trump campaign to vote early, and in fact they're responding to the doubts that Trump has sown about this. They might find that they go to these polling places to try to disrupt the vote and actually disrupt Trump voters from voting. Now that's in a swing area. You could also find that they go into places like in Philadelphia, for example. There are neighborhoods in Philadelphia where there is no doubt it's going to be a high concentration of Biden votes, and those are votes that Biden probably needs to carry Pennsylvania. And so if people go to those places, they could still maybe disrupt things for Biden voters. But I do think that most people are looking at this point, and despite all the worries that have been around, I think many of them well placed for a long time, and many of them printed in the pages of The Atlantic, I should say, over the last couple months by me and others, about how many things could go wrong. I think we may see that we get a more definitive result next week than what we were looking at. There's just been a real turn in the race. That doesn't mean that Biden will win. I think that it's also possible that we'll see, like we knew on election night 2016 that Trump won. I knew it by about 10:30 at night that night, and the Clinton campaign knew it by about 8:30. So, I think we actually will know.
Right. It might not be election week. It might end up being election night. If there's
and look, part of the reason why you see the Biden campaign trying to run up the score, which is definitely what they're trying to do. They are feeling. There is no question that the Biden campaign is feeling confident at this point. But Jill Biden was in Georgia today. Biden himself is going to Georgia tomorrow. Kamala Harris is going to Texas on Friday, right? Like Biden is going to Iowa now. And
these are all states that you think are realistic, that these are real chances.
Well, what they're essentially saying, I mean, going to do a rally in a place doesn't always do that much. And I will tell you, having been to some of these rallies during the pandemic, it's like, so 150 people show up. It's not like the thing that'll turn it, but you do get a lot of press coverage and whatever. But the way the Biden campaign is acting is that they feel like they are going to win, and they want the win to be really, really definitive. And so that they can say to anybody other than Donald Trump, who is probably not going to accept a defeat if one comes, I mean, he lost, right? Like you all see it, right? Like it's not close. It's and there is something very important to that strategically and politically, right? To making it harder and harder to make the argument that anybody should stand with Trump, if that's the way things are going. But look, I was at the Javits Center at Hillary Clinton's party covering an election night, so it's not done yet.
It's an important reminder. I guess I wonder, Mattie, when you sort of look at sort of 2016, what lessons do you take? Or how do you sort of think about how to make sense of what's happening now?
Well, I certainly am not going to find myself the day after Election Day or the day after, whenever we know the answer, doing what I did in 2016, which is blogging for Elle.com as I cried watching Hillary Clinton give her speech the next morning. That I will not be doing again. I have said for the past 4 years that I got out of the prediction business after 2016. I actually feel somewhat fortunate that I was working at Elle magazine at the time, and our editor at large was Melissa Harris Perry, and she spent the whole summer telling me Trump was going to win. And so she was a kernel of truth in an otherwise unreliable landscape. So I think, Adam, we talked about this earlier, but I feel very much prepared for the reality that somehow Trump could eke it out. I don't feel prepared for the reality of what the next 4 years would then hold, partially because I just can't wrap my mind around it, and partially because, as many people smarter than I have noted, there really doesn't seem to be a whole lot of agenda for what the next 4 years will look like if Trump is back, who exactly will staff his revolving door of cabinet posts, what policies they'll be pursuing besides general havoc. So I think the lesson I learned is to not be so caught off guard, to not be so wedded to one outcome that you are crying the next morning while you're typing up your blog post. But also I think I understand, I've been watching more the story that the press tells about itself through having got that wrong last time, and the self-consciousness, I think, about not wanting to do that again. And therefore, a feeling that I think if we had these numbers and we're looking at these polls and we were looking at the true unchanging quality of this race over the past several months, if it had not been for 2016, I don't think you would see nearly the level of hedging that you see now, that we all feel, of like a sense of, I don't want to call it right now because things are too volatile and we could be wrong again. Certainly, I'm aware that if Biden does pull it off, there will be a lot of people saying, well, wasn't that so obvious? Things haven't basically changed in this race since April, since the primary was wrapped up. And I'm conscious of that too. But I feel really lucky that I don't have to write the kind of pieces that purport to know exactly what's happening. Instead, I get to publish angry takes from women about why the Amy Coney Barrett nomination is so terrible. And I'm happy to be in that position right now.
Right. Well, hopefully they'd be less terrible takes in at a certain point.
You know,
nice
one can never, believe me, with the cabal of writers that I like to work with, they will definitely still find what to be angry with under a Biden administration. And that brings me solace. I'd like to keep the passion high, but maybe the anger like dialed down 10%.
And so when you look at now, it's sort of the turnout that we're seeing, how do you read that? I mean, because on one hand, it's sort of responding to the fact that we're not, jumping to conclusions yet. And so there's obviously voter enthusiasm or a sense of voter urgency. But I mean, also when you see these huge lines, does it also sort of represent voter suppression? Like what's your read on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's been true. That's been true in every election where enthusiasm sometimes gets conflated for the idea that it has to go this way, that if there's a really passionate turnout, it simply must mean that people wait in a 4-hour line. That's not inevitable. It doesn't need to be that way. Particularly during early voting. It's only recently that many of these states have expanded early voting. There used to be even fewer options to vote. And there are many, many complicated reasons for that kind of voter suppression, even in blue states like New York, which I'm sure some people on this call saw AOC talking about that just today or yesterday, was it? Of talking about how just election administration in this state, which is a blue state, has been lacking. I think for a lot of people, though, I can just say anecdotally among my friends, I didn't even consider going to vote the first day of early voting or the second day of early voting because it's a weekend. And I thought, like, well, why don't I be smart and go during a weekday since I can and face a smaller line? And just from my friends, I heard from a bunch of people who said, like, I just want to go do it. I've been waiting for this for months, years. I just want to be in line. I just want to go have done it. And I think that quality among people who, again, anecdotally, feel very secure in the idea that they will be able to vote, have the time in terms of their jobs and their lives where they can afford to wait on a line. There was a willingness and a feeling of participation in doing that it wasn't like those people thought, oh, it'll be shorter on a Tuesday. They wanted to be there on Saturday or Sunday. They wanted to be in a long line. They wanted to feel part of it. And wanting to wait in a line after this season of lines, I do think that enthusiasm does say something. I certainly would love to never wait in line again.
Yeah, no, look, you've been hearing some stories of these sort of inspiring sort of civic moments of people getting together and like in these lines. And it's I think also after COVID of people feeling isolated, there's a sort of common moment that's been coming out there. What sort of, are there sort of certain demographics that you're watching as these votes come in, or certain races that you're particularly interested in this year?
I think for us, we're always watching the gender breakdown in so many of these states in terms of the turnout of white women in places like Georgia, where nationally basically how the majority of Black women certainly are going to vote, but in places where white women could make the difference in the suburban swing from Trump to Biden, and from in these Senate races and even farther down ballot races, of how white women are mobilizing, how Latinas are mobilizing, certainly in some states out west. That's always a story that we've been covering. One thing I like to tell people about Glamour is that, like, even though our readers do not possibly veer mostly, for the most part, into this demographic, there's no more reliable, loved story on the site than a story about older women doing things. And I mean like 80 plus, 90 plus women doing things. So we're always watching for those stories. I try not to find it like too heartwarming when someone who's 104 has to go wait in a line. I wish that person would just be able to get in and out quickly, but it is true that the readers, they do love like a nonagenarian who has made her way to vote. So we are always looking at those. And then in terms of the races, I think there's been sustained interest in Sarah Gideon and Susan Collins in Maine. Again, in part because of some of the writers that we work with, Teresa Greenfield in Iowa, certainly interest, even though it's Jamie Harrison against Lindsey Graham, there is certainly interest in that race. And we've been watching that too and seeing how women have been mobilizing for him as a candidate. So I think when I think back to 2016 too, and I was at a different publication, but still a similar demographic, the name ID that some of these Senate candidates have among our readers is markedly higher. And I think the engagement from, your average Danielle in Michigan in terms of following these races and feeling really invested and counting on an outlet like Glamour to talk about them is definitely higher than what I experienced when I was at Elle. And the focus was so much on Trump versus Hillary. So that is different.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. Isaac, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of you've been looking at Michigan pretty closely, and can you talk a little bit about what went wrong in 2016? I mean, the Clinton campaign was very confident, and obviously, what did they ultimately get wrong?
Pretty much everything. So there is a story that I wrote in 2016 when I was still at Politico that got into just how badly they screwed up Michigan. And I think the story is several thousand words long, and there were a number of things that we ended up cutting from it for space, and a number of things that I've learned about since that got into just how badly they missed what people cared about in Michigan, how voters were turning overall against Clinton and toward Trump, the lack of enthusiasm that was there for Clinton among African-American voters, which was real. I said before, it was 10,704 votes was the margin. And between 2012 and 2016, the drop-off in votes in Wayne County, which is where Detroit is, was about 50,000 votes. So right there, it's 5 times the margin. There were a lot of people who went in to vote and skipped voting for president and voted for like House candidates or state legislature candidates. You imagine people like, you go and do all the things you need to do to go vote and then just skip voting for president. That's the lack of feeling that there was for Clinton, but also for Trump. And I think one of the things that we saw in 16 is that it's true that both of them got millions of votes and Hillary Clinton got more votes than anyone else, but some of that is the country has gotten bigger, right? And some of that is also because, and I don't mean this in the way that Donald Trump usually raises it, but that like there was a huge turnout for Clinton in California and New York, and that accounts for a lot of her popular vote lead. But in Michigan, Donald Trump won the state with fewer votes than George Bush got in 2004 when he lost the state, right? So it's about getting in touch with people, making them feel invested in the campaign and in the candidate, and making it feel like it's part of their lives. And I think what we see over the course of these 4 years in the country overall, and the reason why people are reading about Jamie Harrison on the Glamour website, like that's crazy, right? But it's what's gone on in a much broader sense all around the country, which is that people feel like politics matters. And they're engaged with it in a way that they weren't before. And there's this sense, I think, that really like the country overall, and certainly the Democratic Party, had sort of hit rock bottom, in the AA terminology, and when it comes to politics, and that there was a real need to rethink and rebuild the entire way of going about it. And I was talking to the state Democratic Party chairwoman in Michigan last week, and I said, so like, what are the funky, interesting things that you did? And she was like, there's no magic. We just kept people knocking on doors and talked to them about issues that mattered to their lives and stayed in touch with them. And those became Democratic voters. And I think when you look at all the ways that people have become engaged, whether it's just paying attention to more than just the horse race part of this, or more than the presidential part of it, and down to the Senate races, down to House races, more people running for office, more people talking about why it matters. Groups like Indivisible that have really lit up even if it's just 25% of Democrats in a county that's very deep red, that have made them feel like there's a community, or all sorts of things that have changed how this went over the course of the last couple of years. It has just transformed politics. And I was talking to Cecile Richards a couple days ago, who was at Planned Parenthood in 2016 and now runs a group called Supermajority, which is about engaging and activating women in politics. And we were talking about the Women's March in 2017, which I was at that in Washington. And I went basically because I thought I should go see what's going on with this. And I was blown away by how many people were there. I think everybody was blown away by it, right? And she said to me, if any of the groups, Planned Parenthood, any of these big groups that are around could have, if any of them had tried to organize a women's march, it would have cost them like millions of dollars and taken them years to do, and it wouldn't have been as big, right? And there is this just awakening that's going on everywhere. And in Michigan, you see it too, to bring it back to what I was saying. And somebody used that phrase to me, awakening, for what happened in 2018 in Michigan, where the state went just completely Democratic in a way that it was always kind of like a bluish purple state before Trump won it. It was never a red state, never a Republican state, really. And then it just is like every Democrat basically running in 2018 won, and that invigorated the sense that politics was working for Democrats, but also that it put people in offices that mattered, right? The Attorney General in Michigan is like, you think about, what works in the Midwest? The Attorney General of Michigan is a very left Jewish lesbian woman. And she won statewide in Michigan in 2018. And she, instead of being in a position that a Republican AG might have been in, of trying to tamp down on voting, she recorded this ridiculous PSA last week where she's like in a Halloween costume and saying like, I'm not scary and neither is voting, or something like that, right? But like that's, and then using the powers of the office to protect early voting, right? Those are things that matter. And those are like, all of those put together, why it becomes harder and harder to see how Trump would have any chance in Michigan.
And it seems to me that, there's one sort of striking detail to me in the piece you wrote in 2016 where someone was trying to get, an old lady actually, I think, was trying to get a sign to put in her yard, and she was turned away. I don't remember the exact phrase, but something like it's just statistically insignificant or mathematically, like, to give you, like, and sort of, it seems like, do you think the lesson, even with COVID, has been, like, it sounds like you're saying it has been learned, that there is sort of a ground game and an attention to detail and like local issues that is going to win, that is going to help win these races. Is that fair?
Yeah, there is, in part because they had no choice, right? Like they were really, 2016 went about as badly for the Democrats as it could have gone, right? And Trump didn't just like win, right? He won every contested state except for New Hampshire. The Republicans won most of the Senate races that they wanted to win. They kept their control of the House. They expanded in a couple of places in state legislatures. And that's Donald Trump, who, whatever else you think of him, good or bad, or whatever, he is like, was running, he is the least qualified by any of the normal measures we've used to be president of the United States, who was ever a national party candidate. He was running the worst campaign, and he won against someone who was, by all measures, pretty strong. So that made the loss even more bitter for the people who were trying to take it in. And they spent a lot of time crying, but then the people who were working on this got, by even December of 2016, there was the beginnings of what has started to roll over the country over the last few years.
David has a question about the Georgia Senate race. David, do you want to jump in with your question?
Sure. Thank you both. This has been really interesting. I'm very much looking at all the Senate races and looking at the margins and trying to see who I should be pushing and donating to. And I've been seeing Reverend Warnock sort of pushing himself and come up in the running. And I know that's going to be a runoff, but do you think he has any shot in that runoff? And give me your sense on where Georgia's going.
I'll leave this one for you, Isaac. Go for it.
Okay. The answer is that Georgia demographically is going in a direction that's not very good for the Republicans. Politically, probably brings it in line with where Virginia is at this point, as like a southern state that has some southern tendencies, but like the voting trends, and now Virginia is a completely Democratic state. Stacey Abrams, when she was running for governor 2 years ago, her like theory, which proved to be mostly true, is that it was about activating voters who were already there and who hadn't been voting. And part of the reason why she came so close to winning is because she did a pretty good job of activating those voters. And there are new voters. Atlanta is growing in major ways. I don't know how the pandemic has affected that specifically, but in the years before it, that was happening a lot. So Warnock is, like there are 2 Senate races in Georgia this year. One of them is a special election, which is the Warnock one. One of them is a regular election. Georgia has this weird runoff thing. So Warnock, one of the things that seems to be standing in his way is that Joe Lieberman's son is running in that race too, and the state Democrats have tried to push him out of the race. Barack Obama has endorsed Warnock as part of an effort to push Lieberman out. But it's also about how those 2 races are going to relate to each other, because they'll, whether the Democrat in the other race is John Ossoff. And so Ossoff and Warnock have kind of teamed up, hoping to both push up each other's votes. But I don't think anybody would expect that Warnock would win outright on election day. And that means that I think it's the first week in January is when the runoff would be. Generally, the way that this stuff has gone is that the runoffs favor Republicans. So we'll see if that's true here. In 2016, Louisiana has a runoff law too, and so in 2016 there was a runoff that the Republican won, and I think every time for the last bunch of years that there's been one in Georgia, the Republican has won.
Thank you.
Mattie, to jump into other lessons learned from 2016, one of the sort of interesting ones we've seen in the last debate, Trump has tried to make an issue out of this trying to create a similar scandal to the one with Hillary's emails to Hunter Biden's laptop, and it's obviously not gaining the same traction. What do you like? Do you think the media has learned a lesson about how to handle those kinds of allegations more responsibly?
I mean, yes, to some degree. I think the circumstances of how the material came into the hands of journalists differ. And I think one of the things, and I know we were talking about this earlier about Ben Smith's column in the Times this week about the kind of guardrails that legacy media has put up. But I think too, the dribbling out of the TikTok of how exactly the Republicans themselves try to see the story is like, journalists are a proud group too, and they don't like to be taken advantage of in that way. And I think that is also part of it. I think in terms of Trump's behavior himself, obviously he pushed that narrative very hard in the first debate, and it played really, really badly for him. A big narrative that came out of the Hunter laptop scandal was just that Joe Biden's like a really loving dad who wants to be kind to his troubled son. That, I don't know if that's great, like super media savvy on the part of the Trump campaign. But I think too, you could leave aside the issue of how the media and newsrooms have been handling the laptop itself and just look at Trump's behavior in the second debate. Yes, he did nod to and bring as his guest the absurdly named Tony, whose last name I won't even try to pronounce.
Belinsky.
There you go. He did bring him, and he tried to sort of like leave these tea leaves in terms of what he was talking about, referring to Joe Biden as a big man and doing these things, but he actually like stopped short of going for the full-throated Hunter attack again. If the awareness on Trump's part is that that is playing badly and isn't a good idea, it's not really in a ton of people's best interest to pick it up to the same degree. Not that what Trump makes an issue necessarily has to be picked up by the media, but the bigger an issue Trump makes it, the more responsible coverage it demands. And even Trump seemed to back away from it a little bit in this debate. At one point, he literally said, "I could go on about Hunter, but I won't." And so I think that tells you that he recognized that it didn't have the same resonance as a hashtag Hillary's emails sort of situation. And of course, I think there's always with these things a gendered aspect. I think Hillary was uniquely unpopular and important in a way that Hunter isn't. He's not a national figure in the same way. So I think there's a lot of factors at play. I think, yes, you can see that news organizations didn't make quite the same decisions, but I also think as a figure, as a person on which to project the anxieties of all these different people, Hunter's laptop and Hillary's emails are just not going to play the same way because Hunter isn't the candidate.
Do you have a sense, though, that this story, like when I was watching as somebody who's not well-versed in what's happening on Breitbart, didn't mean, like, I think there was a large segment who were watching this debate and it didn't really mean anything when he was talking about, the big laptop story or whatever, however you framed it.
And right with the tiny windows, like those things.
What's he talking about? But do you have a sense, I also had a sense that these references are sort of like this, like almost just like Harry Potter or like Game of Thrones universe that like totally makes sense for a whole segment of the population. Sure. And then the question is like, what responsibility does the media have to cover, what's happening with 30% of Americans who are following? I don't know what the number is. Maybe
right. Where's the vulture recapper for all of the hints dropped by Trump during that debate? I mean, I think the fandom comparison is real, particularly because throughout this entire process, Trump has tried to deepen his strength with the people who already vote for him to a degree that it does feel a little bit like a fan club more than a voting bloc at some points. I think that the calculus and being at a national publication, Isaac might be able to speak well to this too, but like in terms of thinking of where you draw the line between drawing attention and legitimizing something just by covering it, and what the service is to readers in terms of doing that compared to saying like this is a sideshow and it's not as urgent as some of the other pressing questions of this election. That's a choice that every newsroom has to make. I mean, I can speak for me personally and say that in terms of what we feel the need to cover, we see so much more traction and frankly, so many more readers, women across the country who are truly embroiled in QAnon compared to Hunter's laptop. And yes, these are things of a piece in terms of how conspiracy theories spread. But I do think that there's a lot more work that, and news organizations are doing it really well, I think increasingly in terms of like, what is the calculus on something like QAnon, which is rapturing people up, and especially women, across many different demographics, and how do you responsibly cover something like that where the segment of society that is being touched by that is really growing? I think it seems for now that Hunter's laptop remains a niche issue that is most interesting to diehard Trump people, and there are other things that are taking up more and more of people's mental space that feel different than that, but that's a decision every organization has to make.
Isaac, is that something that's been going on in Atlantic News, the newsroom, like sort of what the calculus is on covering those questions?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been in the Atlantic newsroom since March, but like in 2016, I worked at Politico. Politico ran a live Podesta emails blog on the bottom of its site. Wow. I thought that was a bad idea at the time, and I told them that. And they thought it was great for traffic, and it was, and so they kept it on there. I think that there has been some degree, I would say probably not nearly enough of a degree of rethinking of what happened in 16, especially because like it's pretty obvious that there was Russian intelligence mixed up in that, and that we were getting played. And also, as more reporters have been hacked, which has happened, that's made reporters less or more sympathetic to why hacking is maybe not like the best way to go about getting stuff. Obviously, I get things passed to me all the time that I'm not supposed to have, but it's different from them being stolen. But that's what WikiLeaks was trying to blur the line on with what a leak is and what what theft is. So I think that in our newsroom, it has not actually been much of a discussion about what to do because it's just been so, the laptop stuff is on its face obvious. I'm sorry, my 5-year-old just walked in. The laptop stuff is on its face very problematic, and it is obvious that there is a reason why Rudy Giuliani does not want to give anybody other than the New York Post these emails to verify. If he felt comfortable in them, then they would be out there. All those emails, all of John Podesta's emails that everybody read were John Podesta's actual emails, right? Like they really were. I don't think that we know exactly what's going on with this laptop. There are a bunch of theories, some of which I find more compelling than others. But it just feels like they're trying to play a game again. And I think most reporters feel like if there's the lesson learned at least is like, let's find actual news content in this before we jump at it. So far, even like if you believe every one of the emails is true, that there is like a real email, and take the worst possible view of it, it still doesn't add up to all that much. And that's the problem that I think that that Giuliani and Bannon have with this on top of it, where it's just like, it's not clear what the story is. Right. What is definitely true, just to be clear, is that Hunter Biden has led a messed up life that has included his struggles with addiction, but has also included him trying to trade off of his father's name. It's definitely true that he worked for a Ukrainian energy company and had no great reason to be hired by that company other than who his father was. But that where it falls down is whether Joe Biden was involved in it. Right. And so nothing has really substantiated that. And a lot of reporters, me included, went looking for that evidence. And it's just not there. Anything that anybody's been able to see. If there was something to it, I guarantee you it would be published at this point.
Right. No, that certainly makes sense. And it's interesting that you actually have given it as much attention as you seem. Like, I'm even a bit surprised to hear that. But it's an interesting question to me of how to balance, even with, as Mattie was saying, the QAnon stuff. Like, even if we totally decide it's totally not newsworthy, how do we explain why it's so many, Americans might be obsessed with this story and see more meaning in it than there is. So that's, I don't know. It seems like, it does seem like the media has struck a better balance than in 2016 for all the reasons you both mentioned. Mattie, I wonder, so if the polls are right and Biden is elected, what is it, what was he the best, would you think that says that he was the best candidate for this race? And if so, what does it mean that like the best candidate was a 74-year-old white man?
78.
78.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry.
I know he's looking so fresh.
Right.
He's actually older.
He's technically 78, like 2 weeks after the election, but yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
He'll be 78 on inauguration day if he
yes, definitely.
So I think in a lot of ways he turned out to be, through the accident of this absolute accident of a year, a very, very strong candidate for this particular moment. And I think this moment also allows him to glide over some of his weaker points. He has barely had the opportunity to do some of the kind of rhetorical gaffes that he is so well known for, because he's not headlining huge rallies. He is not making himself terribly available to press. He doesn't need to be exposed in the way that a traditional presidential race would require him to be out there. You don't have the same embarrassing stories about enthusiasm that you would have otherwise if Trump were still packing arenas and Biden's turnout at, that kind of meta story about what the enthusiasm is for him. If this were a traditional race, you might not have that. And those kinds of things do take a toll over time and how a candidate is perceived. So in terms of his drawbacks, those have been sort of nicely papered over by this. And in terms of his assets, as the person who was in the administration when they passed Obamacare, healthcare was top of mind in 2018, and it continues to be so important. His general kindness, for lack of a better word, or apparent decency resonates so well with people now. His figure as a grieving national person works very well when hundreds of thousands of Americans are dead. And so, and the stability that comes with having done this job for a long time, this idea of ready on day one, those are all things that probably would have been appealing before and are way more appealing now. I think Democrats and progressives who were really unexcited about him feel an urgency about having a consensus candidate that is different in the pandemic than it would have been outside of the pandemic. So a lot of stars aligned for all the craziness of this year to make him seem even more like a good fit for this race in a way that I don't think he would have been otherwise. In terms of whether the future of the party looks like Joe Biden, I think you only have to look to Senate and House races to know that that is almost certainly not true. That there is a huge appetite for different kinds of candidates in House and Senate races, certainly in legislatures, but even higher up than that. I mean, to Isaac's point about the AG of Michigan, who won in 2018, or even thinking about moderate candidates who don't look particularly like Biden. I'm thinking of when Alyssa Slotkin, who's a congresswoman in Michigan, came by the Glamour office in that kind of coterie of women who won as moderate, Democratic, white, it must be said, women in competitive races, who told me about a clutch of Republican mothers who volunteers in her office, who are attracted to her background in national security. That is not a huge talking point that you're going to hear from progressives, certainly, but it also does not make her look like a Biden someone cut of the Biden cloth. So many of these women who won in 2018, wherever they fell on the ideological spectrum, were first-time candidates who came from illustrious careers in public service of other kinds. I think that is a very popular model for what a Democratic candidate looks like right now. Certainly there are many progressive Black men coming from the Northeast and from the South that create a very different model of what a Democrat looks like. I don't think that Biden's ascendancy in this year says we're going to be seeing a lot more super popular 70 plus candidates. I think even his choice of VP and the knowledge that he couldn't possibly get away with selecting someone who ticked one demographic box the same as his says something about his awareness of that fact.
We're getting to the end of our discussion. So if anyone has a last question for Mattie or Isaac, this would be your last call for that. Mattie, how do you think, given that sort of demographic difference and sort of where it feels like the energy in the party is, how do you think Biden is going to be able to hold a party together? What do you expect to happen if there were?
With Scotch tape. I mean, good luck to him. I think it'll really depend on what his margin of victory is if he wins. And it will depend so much. I mean, it's impossible to talk about him winning and not think about what the Senate outcome is going to mean for the kind of first term that he could potentially run. I think, like Obama in 2008, he will do his best to bring together a coalition around stimulus, which will be sorely needed at that point, and dealing with the pandemic response. Those are two kind of like, you could imagine the claim coming from him and from his administration that there's a laundry list of things they want to do, but they can't do any of those things until the pandemic is under control and the economy has been worked out. That you spend a lot of like political capital just by working on those two things, and we'll see where he shakes out after that. But it's so dependent on what happens with the Senate. I mean, what a Biden first term looks like if Democrats don't take the Senate, it's truly hard for me to envision what kind of successes he'll be able to land in that situation.
Well, he's the master of bipartisanship, so I'm sure it should come.
The epiphanies are going to be coming fast and furious in January, that's for sure.
That's right. Isaac, as we wrap up, is there? I don't know if you want to say something on. Were you want to jump in on?
No, I think that if you imagine a world in which the Senate goes Democratic and Biden wins, I think that you will see this constant tug of war, and Biden, like in public, but also in Biden's head, which means often coming out of his mouth because he doesn't have a great inner monologue, of like wanting to be the institutionalist bipartisan guy, and also feeling like they're gonna do things differently now, and I think the best example of this because COVID relief and recovery and all of that is whatever the stimulus would be, is going to be a huge part of the first 6 months, no matter what happens. It's very possible you're going to see Republicans, again, in this world where Biden wins and the Senate goes Democratic, because I agree with you, Mattie, that if the Senate stays Republican, Biden is basically just kind of resetting the federal government. They're not doing anything legislatively, as a consequence. But in that more Democratic world, I would imagine that you're going to have a bunch of Republicans resist any kind of COVID relief. And at that point, that will probably be the thing that Biden supports getting rid of the filibuster on. And if it's not that, it'll be on passing a new Voting Rights Act. And one of those two things, I feel pretty comfortable in predicting, will lead to Republican resistance and will lead to Biden doing the thing that he does not want to do. The Senate is like the most sacred thing for him, Senate procedures. And he will back that, and that will be the beginning of what we're either going to find out at that point whether that's like the Biden pressure valve for the activist desire for more, or whether it will be the beginning of him actually moving in more of a direction of things. But I think you're going to see a lot of pressure. The first structural reform beyond those things that you'll start to see pressure for is actually statehood for DC and Puerto Rico, because that's the thing that will have the most direct impact on things and the most immediate impact on things, and which feels more right to Biden than expanding the court, which he does not want to do.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting to see how he walks that tightrope. To wrap things up, Josh has a great question for us to end on. Josh, do you want to jump in with that?
Yeah, I was just wondering, sort of to either of you, what your thoughts are on the engagement of the young vote and how that'll play a role in this election. I know that there are a lot of efforts to get college students in swing states involved. In fact, efforts by people who are in this very Zoom. And then also, if you have a little bit of time, kind of where you think my generation is headed politically. I've sort of experienced and read a little bit about how there might be a bit of a reactionary conservative swing of my generation, but I've also seen a lot of the opposite. It's a lot of, maybe there's just more radicalization. I don't know. Maybe you guys have a better perspective on that than me.
Do you want to take that first, Isaac, and then Mattie?
Sure. So I think that you can maybe hear my kids crying in the background. If so, I'm sorry about that. Donald Trump has accelerated a trend that was already moving in that direction, which is that younger people don't see themselves, by and large, as having a home within the Republican Party. And I think that it will be, the years between like being 15 and 25 for most people are when most people identify themselves politically in a way that sticks over the course of their lives. As for all the data that anybody has gotten on this, that is a group that is very hard identified as not having any interest in the Republican Party long term. It's also not a group that is like committed to being Democrats, but is more progressive minded, independent minded, some Democratic Socialist minded, and I think that will probably shape politics a lot over the course of the next 10, 20 years, because it's funny, like in politics, most people, political operatives, they like are very slow to catch up with things, and they still talk about like, oh, what's going on with the millennials? And like, we're so like, the millennials are not where things are at this point, right? Like, I turned 40 over the summer, and I'm at the like outer edge of being a millennial on the older side of it. But like, right, we're into Gen Z, we're into past that, and so that seems to move the country further away from the kind of country that Donald Trump wants it to be over time. And I think that as far as this year, what you're seeing is, I was looking for a text message from there's a group called Next Gen America that is all about engaging the youth vote. And the executive director and I were texting about it, and he was saying that he's just shocked at how big a shift there has been toward Biden support. Most of the people that I think it's 18 to 34 is really where they focus, and most of those people had been Trump skeptical, Sanders inclined, Biden meh at the beginning of this. And now Biden is outpolling Clinton by 12 points among 18 to 34-year-olds. And I said to him, why do you think this is? And he said, well, the first factor is there's not a third-party candidate that's significant that is drawing support of anybody, but especially among youth voters. Younger people in 16 who felt they didn't like Trump, but they also weren't into Clinton. A lot of them did go for Jill Stein and some into Gary Johnson. He said the second thing is Trump's effect on Republican identification. And the third thing he says is that you're seeing that Gen Z, and I assume at some point we'll have a better name for that, that Gen Z is even more progressive and liberal than millennials are. And so that there is just like, and there is so much more of an energy toward that brand of politics. And it's going to be a question then of who becomes the standard bearer of that. And whether, look, if Biden wins, the chances that he runs for another term in 2024 are realistically not high. He will be 82 years old. Is there a competitive primary at that point, or does Kamala Harris run pretty much unopposed, or does she run a kind of a primary that would be like the 16 primary where there was a clear likely nominee and then a challenge from the left? But it could be in this weird thing that we are waiting, if she wins in 2024, that it's like not until 2028 that we actually see what this is. Or it could be that Biden will lose and then this will all explode over the course of the next 2 months, right? But there are a lot of things going on here. And one of the things that's going to definitely change is whatever happens with the Senate races and the presidential race, there are going to be, there already are, and there are going to be more people who are getting elected to state legislature seats and House seats that are going to start changing the look of the party even more, like Mattie was saying, but also are going to start running for other offices, right? Like the most high profile example is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was a bartender, right? 2.5 years ago, not even 2 years ago, right? And she got inspired by the Bernie Sanders race. She ran, she won a race that nobody thought she was gonna win. She becomes this national figure, but beyond it, like she's being talked about as maybe running against Chuck Schumer for Senate, right? And Schumer is worried that she is gonna run against him. So like that changes politics. Anyway, yeah. Sorry, that was my coming in again.
Yeah. We welcome him. We welcome his participation. Absolutely. So Mattie, what's your sense as a fellow old millennial? What's your sense of the youth?
I'm a young millennial.
Okay.
Yes, I look at Gen Z, and I know that I'm enough of a millennial to not understand many things that are happening on TikTok, but just to add to that, because I think that was pretty comprehensive, the biggest traffic driver to iwillvote.com was AOC's Twitch stream so far in the entire presidential race, bigger than even Taylor Swift's endorsement, also directing people to I Will Vote. AOC on Twitch got the biggest haul of all. I think in the sense that political operatives are figuring out what it means to talk to fellow kids, that those kinds of things are going to have to become more in the popular vernacular of people who are running campaigns. And that will start to come from the candidates themselves who are AOC's age and younger. And you only have to look to organizations like Run for Something that are trying to beef up the pipeline of young Democratic talent across the country in local races, to people who jump in like AOC at the House level or at a mayoral level, which we see a lot too. And campaigns will start to be increasingly reflective of the politics of the people who are staffing them, who are running as candidates. And a lot of that receptivity to changing the way things go will depend on what kind of a youth turnout we get, because the need to appeal to those voters will just feed as those voters become a more powerful and reliable voting bloc. And that will be a driver of elections to come, for sure. But yes, I think expect more Twitch voting initiatives. That is part of what we're going to see coming out of this.
We'll have to become gamers to be active citizens.
Or we'll just have to learn how to like watch, because that was like my initial hurdle, was just like, where do I even go to find this thing? That's how I knew I was truly millennial and not Gen Z.
Right.
But, you know, it's funny. Obama did something on Twitch during the Democratic convention, and most people, like in politics, didn't even know that it happened, and it reached however many millions of people, right? Because Obama still has that connection to young people that does tend to work. But I said to people afterwards, "Oh, so what do you think of the Obama Twitch thing?" They're like, "What? Like, what's Twitch? Is that Twitter?"
Yeah, that's funny. It goes to show though how the hold AOC really has. That's pretty amazing to think about that in comparison. So there's so much more I wanted to get to with both of you, but we're already over time in such a fascinating conversation. As we wrap up, we're going to post a little survey right now in the chat and so it's right there. So if you can click on that as you sign off, that would be wonderful. Just to say, it's very quick, just a minute-long survey to say what you got out of today's session discussion. And I'll just thank Isaac and Mattie, especially during such a busy time for both of you. Appreciate you making the time for this. This was really great.
Fun to do.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, everybody.